Microsoft Flight Simulator 98, the most significant flight simulator upgrade ever. Supports new technologies such as 3D acceleration, MMX.
Oh man, 1998. How I miss you so. These were the good old days when some of the most detailed things that you could find on the internet were new two-dimensional panels for Flight Sim 98. It is here in the late 90s and the very early 2000s that we find the humble origins of what is perhaps one of the most recognized, beloved, and sometimes still used add-on aircraft in all of Flight Sim, the Ready for Pushback 747 Classic. This was one of the first expansions that I can recall being labeled as study level back in the day, and for its time it was extremely densely packed with features and systems and manuals and things to explore. Its origins can be traced to the mid-1990s with a man named Martin Arendt. Arendt was the founder of Applied Emerging Technologies International, or AETI software, and was experienced in working with emergent computer graphic software. Beginning around 1996, he took a special interest in flight simulation as a rapidly advancing educational technology. Arendt convinced a friend of his, one Ralph Louis Tofflemire, to begin working on a 747 Classic panel to sell as a payware expansion for Flight Simulator 98. Tofflemire was a distinguished and well-known Flight Sim panel creator at the time who practically had his own miniature development team. His team was quite skilled in creating highly detailed photorealistic panels for Flight Sim 98, which were often extremely well received. Tofflemire would launch a website for his creations called panelshop.com sometime in 1998 as a storefront for the panels he created, of which apparently there were quite a few, but I've only ever been able to track down precious few screenshots from the web archive through Avsim reviews of his Falcon 50 panel for Flight Simulator 2000 and his Boeing 737 Classic panel for Flight Simulator 98. While the 747 project was under construction, Flight Simulator 98 became Flight Simulator 2000, and the panel project became an entire aircraft expansion complete with a unique high-fidelity 3D model, a custom flight model based on real aircraft performance data and advertised as tested by real 747 pilots, and a complete panel designed by Tofflemire featuring fully unique systems and gauges made with the help of 747 flight engineers and pilots. The AETI 747 was officially published for sale in the spring of 2000 for Flight Simulator 2000 at a price of $29.95 US. Tofflemire did not stop at the AETI 747's release. Instead, he wanted to keep developing on it like a government with an election on the way, and so, with the aid of several friends, experts, and dozens of people within the real-world aviation industry as well as within the flight simulator community, he would spend the next 18 months developing and refining his work, as would the others on the AETI team, to create something even better. AETI would rebrand into VMAX Simulations in March of 2001 and release the new version of their 747 as the VMAX Ready for Pushback, or RFP 747, the following year in December of 2002 for Flight Simulator 2002, at a price of $29.95 US for the download version and $34.95 for the CD version. The CD version came with a copy of Classic S Combo, more on that later, as well as Active Camera, a camera extension for Flight Simulator 2002 and later FS 2004. I think it's worth noting that the download copy of this version of the RFP 747 only came with 3 liveries and the CD version only came with 8. To get more, at least for version 1, you would have had to buy additional livery packs containing anywhere from 3 to 6 liveries each at about $9.95 each. A pretty steep price given that the vast majority of models at the time simply published a free paint kit and allowed painters to upload new liveries for free to their choice of flight simulation library. And it gets worse if you consider that a particular pack may have only had one livery that you actually wanted, with the rest being the equivalent of hard drive filler. And the issue of hard drive space wouldn't be that big of a deal either, except that for some reason each livery is given its own aircraft folder entirely, meaning dozens of copies of the same model, aircraft config, and air files for no real reason. Now, this would be somewhat forgivable if, for each texture version, there was a different model of 747 being used, such as the United one being equipped with JT9D Pratt & Whitney engines, and the Lufthansa one being equipped with higher thrust CF650 engines through GE, but that's just not the case. The whole thing just rather unnecessarily gobbles that precious hard disk space, which was so limited back in those days, and charges you money for doing so. Overall though, this was a landmark release, completely revamping the original with a whole new 3D model, which included, for the first time, a 3D virtual cockpit, a completely redesigned and expanded panel with a more realistic layout, a redone flight model designed to take advantage of advances made within the Flight Simulator 2002 Flight Dynamics engine, and a fully customized sound set. Almost right away, it was cemented into the legacy of Flight Sim as a pretty legendary release, a must-have of its time that anyone who enjoyed advanced simulations could probably not do without. Of course, VMAX did not stop there. No, they still had that election to win, so they continued work upgrading the 747 panel with more accurate gauges, yet another flight model upgrade, revisions to the virtual cockpit and 2D panels to give a more cohesive feel, and dozens of smaller fixes and upgrades. This upgrade was called the Ready for Pushback 747 second generation and was released as a separate purchase in May of 2004 for $29.95 US, though existing RFP 747 owners could upgrade for just $19.95. Boxed CD copies were also made available through various retailers and publishers, which could be purchased for $39.95. The panel shop boys seemed to learn their lesson about selling the livery packs because with the version 2 product they released the livery packs for free. If you bought the CD version, every one of the 55 liveries included would be installed, and with the download version you still had to download a pack of liveries that perhaps only contained one that you actually wanted, and each one was still installed as a separate aircraft folder with its own copy of the model and config files on the hard disk. But at least you didn't have to spend any cold hard cash on it now, and could just delete the liveries you didn't want after installation. Anyway, that's enough preamble ramble. Let's stop wasting time and check out the RFP 747. The box for the first version of the RFP 747 is published directly by VMAX, no third-party publishing involved on this one, and it definitely has something of a graphic design is my passion kind of feel to it, and it's not too hard to tell that the budget for printing and creating the boxes was maybe not the top priority, but it does a fine job of showing the product with features and screenshots, as well as this photo of Captain Dave Walsh, who at the time was an active 747 captain who served as a technical consultant for the RFP. Inside this box is just a little cardboard cradle insert to keep the shape of the box, a coupon for 5% off Go Flight hardware expansions courtesy of VMAX, and the installation disc in an unmarked jewel case. The second generation version that I have is published through Just Flight and looks much more professional, being from a reputable and well-established publisher. This one unfortunately seems to be missing any manuals or advertisements that would have come with it when it was new, and that's a shame, but it does still have the installation disc so we can install the thing with the disc. From here on out, I'm only going to be discussing the Generation 2 version of the RFP 747, as I simply don't have the time to try to talk about both versions and all of their differences in a single video, but I may come back to version 1 as a sort of short extra content video sometime in the future. The installation menu is packed with stuff to read and see, and even has ambient background noise.
Departure, good morning, Eagle Flight 149 is out of 43 for 5. Apollo and 8000, Eagle Flight 149.
The contact, registration, and website links take you to either panelshop.com or simpilot.com, the former being Tofflemire's storefront and the latter being the website for VMAX at the time, and sadly neither of them exist anymore. For some reason, clicking the installation buttons didn't work from the menu, so I had to manually install each executable from the disk. The installer mentions that the disk needs to be in the primary drive for the executables to work correctly, and I guess having a USB optical drive just isn't good enough. Once you figure that out, installation of each executable is pretty straightforward. What do I mean by each? Well, the RFP 747 disk comes absolutely loaded with stuff to install. In fact, there's more than 2.5 gigabytes of stuff on this disk. And I know 2.5 gigs doesn't seem like much anymore, considering some newer games will top well over 100 nowadays, but you have to remember that in 2004, hard disk space was often quite limited and expensive, and so it wasn't uncommon to have hard drives with less than 60 gigabytes of total space available, much of which was probably already dedicated to work documents and MP3 viruses. Not only that, but Flight Simulator 2004 itself only takes up roughly 2.5 gigs on a fresh install, and that's with the complete installation option, not the compact one. Anyway, once they're all done, you'll have a whole suite of links and utilities on your desktop, the aircraft installed into your flight simulator, some manuals and documents to explore telling you, the user, how not to screw it all up, and there are even training videos to watch that will really take you back to the cursed days of Windows Movie Maker. Several of the items that will have been installed are utility executables. These utilities feature a cargo and combi loader, which can be used to load a desired amount of payload into any one of the installed cargo or combi aircraft. For those unfamiliar, combi aircraft, short for combination, are aircraft that can carry both passengers and cargo on the main deck, and this was a very popular option with real-world 747s. Interestingly, there is no option of a purely passenger loader, so unless you want to enter your weight and balance figures manually in the Flight Sim payload menu, you have no option to fly a properly loaded passenger 747 right out of the box. Fortunately, a passenger aircraft loader was later made available as an extra download from the Panel Shop website, but it seems odd that no such utility was included with the base package. What's more, the cargo and combi loaders really don't work that well. They do load the correct amount of payload to the right places on the airplane, but only after you manually tell it which aircraft you want it to load by browsing for it in your aircraft folder. Yeah, the current cargo fleet down below here does not actually represent what's in your aircraft folder until you manually update it. The combi loader works much the same as the cargo loader, but has additional options for where and how many passengers are to be seated. The two more interesting utilities are the fuel planner and the takeoff calculator. The fuel planner uses inputs about the route you're flying to tell you how much fuel you'll need and where specifically it should be loaded into. The fuel planner does not make use of any inputs for speed or step climbs, and unless you happen to have a performance manual for the 747 handy, you'll have to take a guess at what an appropriate cruise altitude would be, so it isn't the most complete planner. However, if you don't have a utility like Professional Flight Planner X like I do, or if you don't use SimBrief, or if you're stuck in 2004 and neither one of those utilities exist yet, then this will usually get the job done quite nicely. The takeoff calculator is quite handy too, but also incomplete and a bit broken. It uses inputs of takeoff weight, current wind, pressure, and temperature to calculate takeoff distance, engine pressure ratio or EPR setting, speeds, pitch angles, and trim setting. I say that it's incomplete and broken because nowhere is there an option to input the actual center of gravity position of the aircraft, so the trim setting is arbitrary at best. And the takeoff EPR setting calculated for assumed and current temperature do not work off of the same scale, so it seems a bit arbitrary as well. What's more, and perhaps the most glaring oversight, there's no option for flap setting either. A number of 747 operators standardized their flap settings to either 10 or 20 for every takeoff, but most operators left it up to the needs of the specific takeoff which setting to use, so not having this option seems extremely limiting. Plus, the calculator does not tell you which flap setting it's actually calculating for. And no, the manual does not say which setting to use either. It lists flaps 10 as the primary takeoff setting and 20 as an alternate setting. Most likely, this means that the calculator uses flaps 10 for its numbers, but personally I would have liked to have the option to choose. Another included utility is the Classic S Combo, a utility by Dave March, who is the creator of the ProFlight series of air traffic control add-ons and author of numerous other small utilities and add-ons for Flight Sim over the years. S-Combo existed before the RFP 747 as a generic utility to provide extra ambience to your flight sim adventures by way of giving you virtual crew members, passengers, and air traffic control background chatter. The version included with the RFP747 includes some special and specific upgrades specifically for use with the RFP model that expand on the features S-Combo normally gives you. I'd love to say that it was a welcome addition to an already expansive RFP747, but I ran into numerous problems with S-Combo during my trials with it, and ultimately found it to be more hindering than immersive, though your mileage may vary. The program crashed several times, referencing an ATC chatter playback problem. It crashed another time after I stopped a recording session halfway through a flight with the RFP, and I never could figure out how to get the checklist function working. I didn't complete a single flight with S-Combo before it would crash and close. The RFP manual states that S-Combo comes with its own documentation, but no matter where I looked, I couldn't find any. All of that being said, the callouts and flight attendant announcements seemed to work pretty well, and while they did not sound incredible, it was actually surprisingly welcome to have the announcements and callouts present in what would otherwise be a quiet and lonely flight deck.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the captain and his crew, may I welcome you aboard this flight. I would like to bring to your attention that the captain has now turned on the seatbelt sign, and if you haven't already done so...
Start number 3. Valve open. N2 rotation. Oil pressure. N2 20%. Fuel lever on idle. Fuel flow light on 3.
Airspeed active. 80 knots. Check. 100 knots. Rotate 19 degrees. V2.
The last items on the desktop are some documents, one of which is a tutorial flight to get acquainted with the aircraft and its systems, and the other is a list of recent and planned updates. The version you can download online today, more on that later, is a slightly more updated version than I have on the disk here, but for the most part I haven't noted any major differences. After you've had your fair share of reading and messing with executables and watching training videos, it's time to hop into the captain's seat, because soon we'll be ready for pushback. Ah, the old familiar panel. I have seen this panel so many thousands of times, and yet still there is something very comforting and nostalgic about it that will always give it an unmistakable charm. The RFP panel is a beast of its era, with several pop-up windows representing the 747's various flight engineer panels, as well as the default GPS to aid in navigation for those who have never used the INS or Inertial Navigation System before. Speaking of the INS, the RFP747 comes bundled with an INS programmed by Harold Geyer called the HGHB INS, which I think is designed to resemble the real-world Lytton 72 model INS that many 747s were equipped with. And it would be quite impressive, provided that it worked well enough to use. I could not complete a single flight with the HGHB INS without the flight simulator crashing to desktop entirely, even after following the directions here that instruct the user to delete the INS data file if this should happen to you. Luckily, if you're handy with panel configuration files, the RFP747 makes it very easy for you to switch to the much more well-known and much more functional SIVA INS by Simufly. Make sure that you don't miss any of these sections though, because even so much as having the HGHB INS on the panel anywhere seems to be unstable. I accidentally forgot a section removing the old system from the 3D virtual cockpit, and subsequently paid the price with a crash to desktop during climb out with the event viewer showing that the INS gauge was indeed responsible. With the HGHB INS removed, I have not encountered too many other stability issues, so that's good. There's a good chance that this is just something related to Windows 7 and its differences over Windows XP, as I haven't encountered any of these crashes on my XP machine. Moving on from that, the rest of the panel is a faithful recreation of the 747 instrument panels by 2002 standards. Most of the bitmaps are done by assembly of handmade graphics, which at the time was quite the departure from the standard of using photographs to create different panels. The visual results aren't exactly breathtaking, but they do a perfectly adequate job of representing the panel in my opinion. The panel features handy click spots to switch between and open or close every other panel, an approach viewpoint to make seeing over the glare shield easier, and even includes a custom night lighting bitmap rather than simply relying on Flight Simulator's default pseudo floodlight system that just bathes a panel in a solid color of light. I'll let the videos here speak for themselves more than I will talk about what the panel does and doesn't do, but suffice it to say that operating the 747 from the 2D flight deck isn't too difficult. I say too difficult because I did and do have challenges with it, like the lack of any included 2D side panel views. Instead, you only get the virtual cockpit, which as we'll find later is not exactly ideal. Some of the gauges are just too small and plain hard to read at a resolution of 800 by 600 on a CRT screen, and one of my biggest gripes is that you can't change the frequency of the radio that's dialed into the glare shield panel here, despite the mouse cursor misleading you into thinking that you can. On the real 747, this panel is most commonly a navigation radio, nav1 on the left side and nav2 on the right side. The reasoning for this placement is extremely logical. The 747 did a lot of flying using the nav radios for, what else, navigation. Departures, arrivals, and sometimes en route flying was quite commonly and sometimes exclusively done by VORs and airways, which required frequently changing the nav1 or nav2 radio as necessary, hence the placement right up front directly in front of the pilots. The fact that you can't change the frequency here and instead have to open a separate panel, dial in the frequency you want, then manually switch them, makes flying via radio navigation exceptionally more task intensive and often leads to task saturation in a busy environment. In the end though, I can't help but love this panel and everything about it, and I know a significant part of that feeling is purely nostalgia, but I don't care. The RFP is great, this panel is great, let's move on now to the exterior models. The exterior 3D model is quite good for an early 2000s flight sim expansion. It features high-res textures and all kinds of animations, perhaps the most well-known of which is the multi-segmented wing flexing animations. These animations are pure gold for the time, and as far as I can find, this may be the first or one of the first add-ons to ever include this feature in Flight Simulator. Close inspection reveals the small gaps in the wings where the wing flex breaks are, however on a CRT monitor running at the intended resolution of 1024 by 768 or even 800 by 600, it is nearly impossible to see these gaps. Some other noteworthy features that were becoming standard for 3D models in flight sim at the time are the tilting bogies of the landing gear, full flight control animations, and night lighting effects on the whole airframe which respond to the switches in the cockpit. This lighting is actually controlled by effect files rather than light map textures, which means that they'll show up during the day as well. I don't really care for this because it results in the aircraft looking washed out from all the lighting that's applied during the day, but apparently most users don't seem to mind even to this day in the newest versions of Prepared. The texture work is nothing short of awesome for its time. The RFP 747 came with a full aircraft paint kit featuring dozens of details applied to the textures, like the fuselage panel lines, exterior sensors, decals and warnings, and much more. The textures look extremely clean and detailed by 2002 standards, avoiding that overcooked appearance that so many paint kit designers create by adding cake layers of grime and shine to their textures. While the exterior model of the RFP 747 is excellent for its day, I will say that visually I prefer the Project OpenSky 747 version 1 model, which was available for free when the RFP was released. The Project OpenSky model just looks more polished to my eye and has a more proper shape than does the RFP in my opinion. That being said, it is difficult to compete with the number of liveries included with the Generation 2 upgrade, as well as having that oh so precious virtual cockpit, which the Project OpenSky model simply does not have. Speaking of which, can I just say that I really don't care for the RFP 747 virtual cockpit? I know that it was designed more than 20 years ago now, and other virtual cockpits at the time weren't exactly perfect either, but this one in my opinion is especially bad. The shaping is all off with these bulbous window frames that have little to no texture detail, and much of the texturing is done with real photos layered onto a 3D mesh which just does not look good. And it doesn't stop there. The already somewhat difficult to read instruments are really small in the virtual cockpit and refresh at only 1 frame per second, which makes them really tough to actually use in flight. It's really cool that VMAX wanted to get ahead of the game and release a virtual cockpit for their 747, but I really think this one could have used some more time in the oven. In all of my hours with the RFP 747, I have barely ever touched the virtual cockpit, much preferring instead to stick with the 2D panels. The virtual cockpit is interactive though, being one of the first truly interactable 3D cockpits in the payware world, and even includes a significant chunk of the passenger cabin that you could explore provided you have a camera add-on, which is probably why the CD copy of version 1 shipped with active camera. The inclusion of the 3D cabin has been divisive, to say the least. I have heard arguments that it is a really neat feature that sets the 747 apart from other contemporaries, and I have heard that it's an unnecessary waste of resources that most users just don't care for or utilize. Personally, I tend to favor the latter. I think it's pretty neat, but ultimately just a waste when processing power was already so limited at the time. Moving on from the 3D cockpit, I'd like to spend some time covering what is perhaps one of the most lauded features of the RFP 747, the depth of the system simulations. Indeed, up to this point, I have not mentioned that VMAX aggressively marketed the RFP as not beginner-friendly and for the advanced simmer only. And while you may be tempted to believe that based on what you see and interact with on the panel, the actual depth of the system simulated in many cases isn't much more than surface level or even non-existent. I won't get too technical and I will oversimplify where possible, but allow me to provide an example. Let us take a look at the electrical panel. There is absolutely nothing on the RFP 747 that requires these generators to be on. You can happily ignore them and fly the airplane from start to finish without ever touching this panel. As you can see here, I'm flying along normally in cruise with the autopilot engaged and all the generators off. On the real airplane, these generators provide electricity to all of the AC and DC systems that power all of the instruments and functions, and they are the only sources of electrical power in flight normally, so what should be happening is that the airplane is essentially dead. On the RFP 747, all electrical power is actually controlled by this single battery switch. Examples like this are riddled throughout the simulation. The only system that seems to be of any consequence besides the fuel system, which we'll talk about in a moment, is the hydraulic system. If the fluid runs out, which is a random failure that can occur, more on that momentarily as well, or if you simply don't engage the system, the flight controls will more or less be locked in place, making flying very difficult. Now, there is a valid argument for the fact that the 747 Classic is a 3-person airplane and I am just a single flight simmer, so simplifying and leaving out some depth and systems is necessary to make the add-on accessible at all. To which I say, fair enough. Tofflemire himself admits with a quote from the manuals, "Not all of the systems on the 747-200 aircraft have been modeled, and for those systems that have been modeled, some are more complete than others." I guess you could say that I was a little disappointed with how surface level most of the systems actually are, given all the hoopla about how it's for advanced simmers only. That being said, the panel is a far cry from the default airplanes included with the simulator in FS 2002 or 2004, and no doubt the average simmer treating Flight Sim like a game at the time would have been floundering trying to figure out how to fly this one without first examining the manuals or having prior knowledge of the 747. And with all of that said, the illusion of messing with various systems is still quite convincing and surprisingly immersive, even when you know that there isn't actually all that much happening behind the scenes. And what is included is quite fun to mess with. There is a fuel jettison system that will dump the onboard fuel should the need arise, which includes a smoke system effect outside the aircraft for visual confirmation that the system is working. The fuel system itself is perhaps the most completely simulated of all of them, with the ability to run the engines from any main tank or the center tank in any combination, making fuel balancing easy and realistic. Also included with the fuel system is a full suite of refueling capabilities. Using this hidden click spot, you can select the closest amount of fuel that is less than what you require for a trip here, and it will be instantly loaded into the airplane. Then the refueling panel here allows you to precisely add the remaining required fuel to your load at an unrealistically fast, but not instantaneous rate. Neat. And you better get used to using this refueling feature, because if you try to manually load the fuel in the payload menu, Flight Simulator will unceremoniously crash to desktop. There is even a random failure system which will very occasionally cause an engine failure, an engine fire, electrical failure, or a hydraulic failure. There is no way to know or control when these failures occur, which is extremely realistic, perhaps too realistic. The failures are extremely remote, but when they do occur, they can ruin your flight and be very frustrating if you don't want to deal with them. This is a flight simulator, not the real world, and I like having control over the things that happen in the sim. If you're programming random failures into an airplane, I say you should at least give the end user the option to turn them on or off. Another unfortunate complaint that I have is that engaging the autopilot can be confusing, sometimes requiring the vertical mode selector to be cycled to off before altitude select will begin controlling the airplane, and unlike the real 747, the vertical modes don't actually control the airplane if altitude select is not engaged. Speaking of vertical modes, the indicated airspeed pitch mode is totally broken. Upon passing around 25,000 feet or so in climb on several occasions, the aircraft would start pitching up out of control rapidly until it stalled. If caught early, you can simply disengage and re-engage the autopilot in the airspeed pitch mode and it will begin working just fine again, but extremely annoying nonetheless. That's really about as much as I feel like saying on the system, so let's move on to the included sound set. The included sound set is very weak in my opinion, perhaps the weakest point of the entire simulation. Standing outside the airplane, the engines have little to no bassy rumble at all, and sound quite underpowered even at maximum thrust. Inside the airplane, the engines sound a bit better, except in reverse, which just sounds like Darth Vader inhaling continuously. Then the environmental sounds end up spoiling the experience further. The sound of wind in the cockpit is extremely light, even at high speed. And the sounds of touchdown are just the sounds of tires squealing, as though you were standing right next to them outside. There are also several custom sound effects, mostly for switches and for warnings. A custom GPWS, takeoff configuration warnings, altitude alerts, the radio altimeter. There are a lot of custom sounds here that sound fine. The sounds are not of stellar quality and in some cases aren't even accurate, for example the overspeed warning. Overall, the sound set is the most disappointing part of the RFP 747 experience for me, but the good news is that this can be easily corrected by simply downloading a different sound pack online. The custom sounds are not affected by installing a new sound set because they're built into the gauge files. If you're really dedicated and have access to the real sound recordings, you can use a program like Resource Tuner to open the gauge files and change or remove all of the custom sounds to your liking. With a complete picture of just about everything else now, let's see how she flies. I gotta say, this is probably the second most disappointing part of the package for me, but I am much more lenient here because not only is building a flight model very challenging, but in these early days of Flight Simulator, coming across people who knew how to make a flight model was exceptionally rare, as evidenced by how few truly good ones there are, and it was just much more accepted back then that a flight model would not be perfect or even necessarily accurate. Much goes the stigma that Microsoft Flight Simulator simply doesn't have as accurate a flight model as something like X-Plane. But that would be good enough for the average user, and VMAX more or less hits the mark here, I suppose. The RFP really does not fly like a 747. For example, at optimum altitude in cruise, the angle of attack is only on the order of about 1 to 2 degrees, whereas the real aircraft would regularly cruise around 3 to 4 degrees at optimum altitude and weights. The engines are frustrating to use at best. The thrust they provide is all over the place. During takeoff and climb out, the engines provide way too much thrust, making managing climbs during a busy departure very challenging as you'll inevitably fall behind the airplane. Even with the engines operating at the maximum D rate, it will still climb way too fast. That is, until you start reaching Mach numbers above 0.5, at which point the engines seem to lose all of their power and climbing at the lower D rates becomes almost impossible. The reason for all of this mess has to do with the way thrust is programmed in the flight model. I'll just show you the RFP 747's thrust to engine RPM and Mach number graph compared with the same graph from my own classic 747 that uses real-world engine data. And if you understand at all what you're looking at, you'll understand why these problems exist. In short, thrust and probably drag are so all over the place that it's hardly worth discussing. Hand flying the aircraft is also challenging because it often does not feel like there is enough authority in pitch or roll, and far too much authority in yaw. The rudder is extremely powerful in yawing the aircraft, and the amount of momentum and inertia involved feels non-existent. It isn't at all difficult to reach or exceed 30 degrees of side slip with the rudder alone on the RFP 747, which is laughably unrealistic, and I have no idea why they programmed the flight model this way. A secondary consequence of this is that controlling the RFP 747 on the ground with my rudder pedals is much more challenging than many other aircraft due to how easy it is to over-control. Also, quite annoyingly, the RFP 747 has a max airspeed of about Mach 0.85, where the real 747 is rated up to Mach 0.92, and several operators authorized or regularly used cruising speeds in excess of Mach 0.85 anyway. Not sure what the thought process was here. I'll wrap up the flight model here because, frankly, it's borked, and there just isn't much worth talking about. It will fly, and you can complete flights with it, but if you're looking for the feel of a realistic 747 in your flight model, then this simply isn't it. Finally, to wrap up this monstrous video, I'd like to discuss the performance and compatibility of the RFP 747. On the side of compatibility and stability, other than issues I've already noted previously throughout the video, I haven't seen anything major. The RFP 747 will quite happily perform short and long-haul flights with whatever configuration of software I've tested for without crashing or causing other programs to crash, provided you remove the HG-HB-INS first and don't use the classic S combo. Nothing else to report here. Performance, however, is something of a different story. On my main recording rig, there are no issues, mainly because that machine is friggin' beastly by FS 2004 standards. Powered by a 3.6 GHz Ryzen 7 CPU, 16 GB of RAM, and an NVIDIA RTX 2060 Super for graphics, I'd be mighty impressed if any add-on was so poorly optimized as to even dent the performance on this machine. However, over here I'm running Windows XP Professional with Service Pack 3 on a 1.9 GHz Intel Pentium 4 with 768 MB of RAM and an NVIDIA GeForce 3 Ti200 with 64 MB of VRAM for graphics processing. Pretty middle-of-the-road specs for a late 2001 to early 2002 machine, which makes it almost perfect for testing something released approximately around that time. The minimum spec specified on the Generation 2 RFP box is a 1.7 GHz processor, 512 MB of RAM, and a 32 MB video card, so my machine does meet the minimum, though only just. Interestingly, the Generation 1 box specifies minimum system specs of just a 700 MHz processor, 128 MB of RAM, and a lowly 8 MB video card, despite having all of the same basic features and polygons as the Generation 2 version, which really makes me want to build a low-end Windows 98 gaming PC just to see how poor the performance is with those specs. Anyway, on the ground, in the default flight situation at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport sitting on runway 34 right, I was averaging about 15 to 17 frames per second in the default Cessna 172's virtual cockpit and on the 2D panel, and in flight in outside spot view, it was sometimes possible to reach the 30 frames per second limit imposed in the hardware settings. Switching to the RFP 747 dents my performance by approximately half in most situations, dropping virtual cockpit performance to nearly unplayable 7 to 8 frames per second, and exterior views barely topping 15 to 20. The 2D cockpit was a little bit better, averaging somewhere between 10 and 15 frames per second, though not exactly ideal here either. No doubt the thousands of extra polygons rendering the virtual cabin combined with the high-resolution textures are partially responsible for that, and this is where I would say that on this machine I would probably stick to the 2D panel flight deck for most of my flying, and hence the problems I mentioned way earlier about not having side views start to come into play, because looking around the cockpit causes a significant performance drop due to using the virtual cockpit for side views rather than having dedicated 2D bitmaps. And most important to note is that this is default performance, as in I am running a completely unsupplemented and unmodified installation of Flight Sim 2004 here with minimal AI traffic without flying into much more intensive areas, such as the New York area where 3 major airports exist within Flight Sim's rendering radius. With weather programs, AI traffic, add-on airport scenery, and modified textures all over the place, no doubt my performance would probably be on par with a corporate PowerPoint presentation more than a flight simulator. As long as you're willing to resist keeping the settings sliders well left of high, turn down the AI traffic, and turn off add-on scenery, it can be manageable. But having all of that extra assorted nonsense is half the fun of flying Flight Simulator in my opinion. Back in the day, if I was running a machine similar to this one, you can absolutely bet I would have been disappointed and probably looking for new PC upgrades. Alright, I think that just about covers it. The RFP 747 is a radical piece of software with lots of bugs and issues, but that ultimately has managed to withstand the test of time and continue to be used in some form or another by those of us who continue to enjoy Flight Sim 2002 and 2004. I so badly wish it would have continued to be further developed. I mean, just think of where it could be today if it had been developed and redeveloped like how PMDG has done with their 737 and 747. However, this was not to be. The second generation RFP 747 would be the last version to see a public release. A third generation version, known to some as the VIP version, was in development for a long time but would never be officially released. Ralph Tofflemire announced in October of 2006 that further development of the RFP 747 had ceased and that no new updates, including long-anticipated patches to make it compatible with then-new Flight Simulator X, would ever be published. From 2004 to 2007, Tofflemire and VMAX would find themselves growing increasingly frustrated with the online publishers hosting the RFP 747 on their storefronts. Apparently, several of these publishers had stopped paying the required royalties and licensing fees from the sale of their 747, meaning that none of the development team was seeing the money for the sales of the product that they made. A frustrated Tofflemire took matters into his own hands in August of 2007 when he published the full RFP 747 Generation 2 online, all liveries and extras included, as a completely freeware product, and revoked the license to sell the product from all online retailers. No doubt the stealing of rightfully earned money was probably what slowed or outright halted further development of the RFP 747 for good. The VMAX website would go offline in late 2008 when the company was split into two, VMAX Flight LLC and VMAX Aero Systems. From then on, the website would redirect users to the AveSim store, a relatively short-lived flight sim storefront hosted by AveSim, itself going offline in 2012. According to Moby Games, VMAX Flight LLC is the home flight simulator branch of VMAX, while VMAX Aerosystems is the commercial flight simulation consultation branch, headed to this day by the aforementioned Martin Arendt. I have not been able to confirm nor deny if this is also the same VMAX that has cooperated with Flight Factor in recent years to develop for X-Plane as well as developing some standalone expansions, but a personal hunch tells me that there's a good likelihood that these are the same companies. Precious little information can be found on VMAX today, unfortunately. Along those same lines, as far as I can find, Ralph Tofflemire did not really engage with the flight sim community at all after releasing the RFP 747 freely, and it's difficult to tell where his life went from here forward. What is known is that he would pass away at a resident care center in Gimli, Manitoba, Canada on March 30th, 2019 at the age of 82. Tofflemire's legacy has endured in the hearts, minds, and hard drives of thousands of us in the flight simulation world. More than a decade after its release, forum threads would still crop up from time to time asking about how the panel could be merged with the more recent 3D models. Dozens of liveries, various modifications, some tutorial flights, and much more have been released by the community over the years to supplement the RFP 747 as well. Today, the expansion is often remembered very fondly, and I still come back to it from time to time in its vanilla state simply because of how much fun it is to use. It also played a huge role in inspiring me to create my own 747 Classic Series panel, which borrows several features included on the RFP panel. For example, this click spot on the ASI to bring up the airspeed bug settings. It is impossible to explain how much nostalgia and fuzzy warmness I feel when I see this panel and hop in for another long transcontinental or transoceanic flight. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoy it, cause I've definitely enjoyed making it. Any excuse to come back to the RFP 747 is a welcome one in my opinion, flaws and all. Be sure to check out my other videos if you're hungry for more retro flight sim content, and feel free to check out my Patreon page if you feel like supporting the channel. Any monetary support you choose to give is never expected, but always appreciated, and will help me make more content like this in the future. Anyway, that's it for this one. Stay tuned.